everyone. Welcome. I just so glad to see you all here as part of our city nature celebration. And we are so thrilled to have Jason Mazurowski with us here this evening. But before we get going with Jason, I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the event that this is part of that's been going on for the last couple of weeks called City Nature Celebration. And this is our third year of doing it. And it was sort of the brainchild of Walter, and I think I saw Alicia here with us, and we should be doing some public presentations about natural history. And so we're really thrilled to be here. It's sort of our first, I would call it, if not post-pandemic, mostly post-pandemic year of being able to celebrate and enjoy nature in Burlington and hear some great talks. So this City Nature Celebration is hosted and organized by Burlington Wildways. And in case you don't know what Burlington Wildways is, it's a partnership group. And let me just introduce myself. My name is Zoe Richards, and I actually direct Burlington Wildways. And it's a partnership group between many of the public-facing landowners in the city. We have two parks departments in our city. One is a regional parks district called Winooski Valley Park District. We have the Burlington Parks and Rec Department. We have the Intervale Center, and we have Rock Point. And we work very closely with UVM often too. And these are some of the major public-facing landowners. And we were started in 2017 by a city council resolution, and we work in partnership around issues of conservation across the city and inclusive access to our natural areas. And so sometimes many of our partners work on many other kinds of things as well, but there are certain times when we're thinking about conservation and trail access that we say we're wearing our Burlington Wildways hat, and we're thinking about citywide access and conservation. And one of the things that we are really excited about is our Burlington Wildways Trail, which is not a newly cut trail. It's just connected a lot of trails that have existed in the city for a while. And it's roughly 10 miles long, and when it's done, it will go right up to the new Keys Lick Park, which is there's a conservation center that will be opening there soon, newly renovated, and it'll be right on a bus line. And you're seeing just part of it here, but when it's fully completed, as we sort of realize it, you'll be able to get to it by bus on either end. And it connects many different parcels of land, and working on this has really connected us in terms of conservation and access. And it only has one road crossing. It'll eventually come off of Killarney Drive and go through Arms Forest, and it'll just have one road crossing. So it's amazing that we have enough conserved and wild land in Burlington that you can walk almost 10 to 12 miles with one road crossing. So City Nature Celebration has been happening for the last 2 weeks, and we've had a number of different events, and we have a number of events that are upcoming. You're here tonight at the Jason Mazurowski's talk about the amazing Bees of Burlington, and this weekend there are a number of different events. The first of which, Saturday, will be the Rock Point Nature Celebration, and I'm going to get my cheat sheet out so I don't miss all the things that are happening. But there'll be a wildflower walk at 10 at Rock Point. There's going to be at 11 some activities around the oncoming of spring with Crow's Path. And at 1, there'll be a wild edibles walk at Rock Point, and I think there's going to be pizza being served in the pizza ovens. And I see Kelly, Executive Director of Rock Point, here, so we're very excited about that. And then on Sunday will be Spectacular Nature Day, and this is the third time we've done Spectacular Nature Day, and this is an opportunity to explore the outdoors in a lot of different kinds of ways. So we will have some opportunities to try sampling eating invasive species, or as we like to say now, noshing on non-natives. I think there'll be some knotweed ice cream and garlic mustard pesto. If you want to participate in the BioBlitz, which Walter's going to talk about, we'll be able to help you learn how to do that there. We've also, for the last couple of years, done some restoration plantings, really hands-on, fun restoration plantings. Last year we planted 300 ferns. right behind the Intervale Center, where we have quite a few invasive species and not as many of the native ferns that we would like to be seeing there. And we were just there, and all those things, those ferns that were planted last year are all coming up. It was like 80 or 90% success rate. So we'll be doing that. We'll be doing some tree planting as well. There'll be folks out in the forest to help you identify birds if you're out there in sort of a casual and interactive way. And I think that's most of what will be happening on Spectacular Nature Day. You can just, it'll be between 10 and 2. You can just come or you can sign up. The sign up just allows us to distribute people across the day. It's all good. But the centerpiece, and the reason that we've done this whole City Nature celebration is around participating in the City Nature Challenge, which is an international bio-blitz. And I'm actually going to pass it over to Walter Pullman, who's going to tell you a little more about that. Oh, whoops, wait. Actually, before I do, I just want to tell you that a few things that have already happened, which are just fun to know about, are last week we hosted, Vermont Public hosted a podcast called But Why, which is a podcast for curious kids about urban wildlife. And we had kids from all over the city either walk or take the city bus and work with naturalist Teague O'Connor, who answered all kinds of amazing questions, and the Flynn generously donated the Flynn space for that. And you can see on the other side that we had an extensive tree planting down at the Ethan Allen Homestead, where 250 trees were planted along a river buffer, and with the Burlington City and Lake semester, a few days beforehand, we planted another 150 trees. So we planted almost 400 trees along the river buffer along the Winooski. And then last week, to kick off our speaker series, we had Destiny Acosta come and talk to us about spiny soft-shelled turtles and some of the work that she's doing to try to restore some habitat along the mouth of the Winooski River. And that talk will be up on the City Nature Celebration website. It might even be up now. Is that true? You can watch it in a few days. You'll be able to watch it. And this talk will also be up on the website, so you can share it with friends later. And now I'm going to let Walter tell us about the City Nature Celebration.
Welcome, everybody. Again, I'm Walter Pullman. I'm an ecologist up at the university, and I'm just really pleased that a number of my students are here tonight, because really, yeah, that's here for NR2. It's a course called Natural History and Human Ecology. It goes all year long, and really, we're deeply grateful to Burlington Wildways and the city, because the city is our classroom, really, and it's enormously important. It's probably the best thing about UVM is being where we are in the city of Burlington and everything that it offers, so we're deeply grateful for that. And this is a collaborative thing coming up. This whole, you didn't know it, but April 27th is called also City Nature Challenge Eve, because people around the planet are getting their devices ready, and they're not just going to be talking, they're going to be using them to basically interact and inventory the more than human world in urban settings all around the globe. And if you look at this, there's over 400 participating cities, which is tremendous. Starting tomorrow morning, or midnight, if you want to get going on it, for 4 straight days, you can be out there documenting, photographing, inventorying the more than human world here. It's a super opportunity. And in the lower right there, this shows the 4-town area. It's really Burlington and the surrounding communities, the greater Burlington area. Full partnership, the city, of course, South Burlington, Colchester, and Winooski, our neighboring city right across the river, is key. And this is really the Lower Winooski watershed and the Winooski River watershed. And of course, Winooski is the Abenaki word for land of the wild onion. And this is really important. Phenologically, it's all happening right now in rich woods and in floodplains around the area. And of course, it's a reminder that this has been an inhabited landscape for 10,000 years of indigenous people. And we absolutely need to acknowledge that and recognize this as the ancestral home and the contemporary home of the Western Abenaki people. And we're also right in the middle of an area called the Champlain Adirondack Biosphere region. a place of remarkable biodiversity and many cultures coming together, many with difficult histories, but we're really hoping and planning and collaborating around a healing future for different cultures in this landscape here. And also with humans in the more than human world is a big part of the vision. And the City Nature celebration is really all about that. So I'm going to go to the next slide here and tell you, boy, it's already begun. If you live in Australia or New Zealand, they're already out counting us. They're a day ahead of us already. And they got a jump start on us. This is iNaturalist, is really the organization whose inventory method we use here. And if you look at this, you can see already, somebody's way, I'm looking at right here, Thailand already had 7 species. But it's going to grow and grow and grow over the next 4 days. And of course, we're going to continue along a little bit after them as well. So we want to catch up. You're going to catch on very quickly. This is a collaboration around global biodiversity, but it's also a fun competition between areas. And this is a place you can go online and you can track what is happening. And here is ours. Right here in the greater Burlington area, we also have this project in iNaturalist. You can see it's a countdown. I downloaded this picture earlier when it was still 17 hours to midnight. But pretty soon this is going to start populating with all of your observations by taxonomic groups and individuals. You need to register for iNaturalist. Of course, it's free to do, and you use your phone. If you don't have a phone, you can do it on your computer as well. But taking part is easy. You basically get out there and find wild things and document them photographically or with sound. You can do sound recordings as well. Birds are singing up a storm right now. If you can get a ruby-crowned kinglet that are out there, you can put it right in there and record it wherever you are. And then you share it with the larger community. And one of the great things about this is it's citizen science, and there's many people who help by identifying your observations or getting them down to what we call research grade, a little more confirmation. Not necessary to be an expert to participate. In fact, we encourage it for everybody. And I love this here. There's actually all these tutorials. This is my first experience with a QR code on my screen, but my students are always taking pictures when these are up there. So you can go and learn about the tutorials there. There's some great ones about how to do this. And if you're a teacher in the audience, especially getting your students involved, there's lots of things out there. Now, a particularly great moment happened this morning down at the newly refurnished Burlington train station. I was down there this morning with a group of people from the Rubenstein School. 3 of our students and one of our staff member all hopped on the train at 10 o'clock and just arrived at Penn Station about 2 hours ago, and they are linking our urban area, the great greater Burlington urban area, with that of New York City, the 5 boroughs, and they are partnering with us, and they're going to actually join the team down in New York City and be documenting things. So this is happening everywhere on the planet right now. And here's, of course, they have their own iNaturalist site as well, and so these will be going up in the urban areas, and they'll be in Central Park birding, they'll be up in Bronx doing tree plantings and documenting species all around. So just wanted to let you know there's partnerships that link Burlington and New York urban ecology. Just to say a little bit more about that, because we're a little competitive here. Here's the numbers from last year. Hopefully you can see those. Can you see those numbers? Yeah, that we had 250 people participating in our little area here. 690 observations, and look how, 690 species were documented. And if you look at that, over 3,000 observations. Now, by comparison, here's what they got in New York, just to show you the results from last year. Yes, they got more species and more observations, but as you know, they have a few more people involved, or at least potentially involved. And here's our populations of our 2 urban areas contrasted together. So we're really what we really want to have happen is have sort of the most observations per capita, or whatever the right term is, most engagement. Burlington could shoot up there this year. And just to show you a few other places that I'll be tracking, and you can track any of the places, maybe it's somewhere where you're from before. Cape Town always does really well. And I don't know what it is. The people, the ecosystems there, they're on the ocean with octopus and things like that. But they do really well. They're the favorites to win again, but we're going to try to give them a run for our money here in Burlington. And it is turning spring here. I think it's turning fall down there, if I have it right. So Washington, D.C., the capital is really engaged. Ukraine has been involved. This was 2 years after the war broke out last year, and participated. It's amazing. So you can follow Ukraine this year, I think. I'm not positive, but they were certainly involved last year. My ancestors are from Scotland, so I'm following that as well. Another college town. We're trying to beat out Boulder because people compare us, Burlington and Boulder. And then my home is, where I'm from, is Ithaca. So they happen to have the lab of ornithology there, so you think they're going to be tough, but we beat them last year in number engagement. So something that is really important is this whole study of phenology. And it's no coincidence that City Nature Challenge is happening just as about we're turning the calendar during this into May. What an amazing time. If you go to Rock Point or Intervale, you're just going to see everything unfurling and unfolding and birds returning and leaf outs happening. What a fabulous time of year. And phenology is really nature's calendar. It's the study of the biological responses to the changing of the seasons. And it's all happening. And one thing we're really pioneering here in Greater Burlington is this whole idea of developing a phenology clock. And one of Zoe's colleagues did an amazing thing. He took the iNaturalist data, wrote an algorithm that would project it visually as a clock for the 60 focal species. If you were here last week, you learned from the BCL students, the Burlington City and Lake semester students, that they were diving into those 60 focal species. But this is a really cool thing. Your observations will be plotted, not only geographically, but they'll be time-stamped. And this is climate change research in action, because the shifts that happen over time will be recorded on these clocks. And we get a snap of time of what's happening. It's unique to each place. It's part of what I wanted to mention. So the phenology clock's all part of it. But really, it's about partnership, too. And Zoe started to share a little bit about all the partners in Burlington Wildways. These are all the groups involved in this endeavor, and all of you in the community, many schools. I want to particularly highlight Main Street Landing. What an amazing facility that they've given, they allow us to use as a group network to be here tonight for that. So we're really grateful to them. And of course, Media Factory is filming this as well. So we'll capture it along with all the other presentations. And then all these groups from the four-town area, I'm not going to name them all right now, but you can see their logos. And I know at the university we're really proud to be partnering with all these great organizations. So I'm going to stop there because it's almost time for Jason, and I'm going to turn it over to Zoe to introduce our speaker. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Well, now I would like to introduce Jason Mazurowski, who is a graduate of the Field Naturalist Master's Program and is currently doing lots of native bee research with the Gund Institute at UVM. And I first met Jason when I had asked if he would come and join us. I was working with Burlington City and Lake Semester High School program, and if he would tell us a little bit about Burlington bees. And he came in the middle of the pandemic with a bunch of high school students who really didn't have very much background in natural history, and told an amazing story of the Bees of Burlington, and showed us his collection, and got kids who really have very little experience and background in natural history completely engaged. And I remember he was telling us all about what happens to the poor old drones in the fall, how they get kicked out and they end up cold sitting on the flowers. And we went for a little walk outside of the old North End Center, and like right on cue, we had asters growing sort of in all the fence lines, and there were the frozen drones we just heard about sitting cold there. And it was such an amazing aha moment for lots of kids who spent a lot of time in Burlington and probably not looked too much at the asters growing on the side and paid too much attention to the bees. And I personally have been enthralled ever since. And I'm so excited to welcome Jason here to tell us a little bit more about the amazing story of the Bees of Burlington. Thank you.
thank you everyone for coming, and thank you Zoe and Walt for inviting me here. I'll start off first by saying that I am not a melittologist, which is someone who studies bees. My background is doesn't have anything to do with insects at all. So I'm not an entomologist either, so that's someone who studies insects. I consider myself more of a naturalist, an ecologist. I look at integrated field science. That's my training in the field naturalist program. And, just a few years ago in 2019, I probably knew as much, if not less, about bees or insects in general than most of you sitting here. So I just wanted to share with you my journey from that point to where I knew nothing about bees or what was going on in the world, and how I was able to learn about the exciting stories that there are to be told out there in the natural world every day. I'll also start off by saying that most of these photos are my own, and they just came from an iPhone. So no special fancy equipment needed. You can leave here today and go out and capture some of these same incredible moments that I was able to capture just by paying attention. And that's going to be the root of my whole talk today, is how to pay attention to the natural world in a way where you start to notice things you never did before. And that's probably my favorite thing about being an ecologist, a naturalist, a scientist, is that feeling you get whenever you uncover this new layer to the story. It's just this kind of mind-blowing, jaw-dropping feeling. So for instance, my training originally was in geology, and my best friends, my two best friends when I was an undergrad were botanists. And so I would go out into the field with them, and I didn't see plants. I had what they call plant blindness. And the more and more I got to know them and hang around with them, the more I started seeing plants more. And the same with birdsong. I grew up my entire life hearing birdsong in the background. It was like the background music in a movie or something. But when I started learning about birds and their life history and what the songs sound like, it's like someone turned up the volume on my life. And you can't turn that off anymore. Like, you're constantly hearing birds. And so the same thing happened to me with bees. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know anything about their life history. And once I started researching them and learning more about them, I started seeing them everywhere I go. And you can't turn that off. And there's a name for this. It's actually called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, also called frequency illusion or frequency bias. So we've all experienced this before. This is, a really good example I can think of is a few weeks ago I had to buy a new car. I bought a Chevy Equinox. I'd never even heard of one in my entire life, and now I'm out on the road and I see them everywhere. Did everyone go out and suddenly buy Chevy Equinoxes? No, they've been there the whole time. My brain didn't recognize them. And so this is, again, my favorite part about being a naturalist, when someone introduces a topic to you that you didn't know anything about before, and then suddenly it's everywhere you look. And I guess my story really begins back in 2017 at this spot, which should look pretty familiar to most of you. This is the thrust fault at Rock Point. And so I was a graduate student. I moved here for the field naturalist program from Montana, and I was convinced that I was a little bit nervous about moving to Vermont because compared to Montana, I did not think it was going to be wild enough. And I was wrong. So very early on in my experience here as a graduate student, we were brought to this spot by Alicia Daniel, who's somewhere in this room, and we discussed the geology of the Adirondacks and Lake Champlain, which was pretty comfortable territory for me, being a geologist. And I became captivated with this spot because we learned about the botany there and the wildlife that moved through there, and we were told that it's connected to the rest of the wild places in Burlington. And I had an apartment in the Old North End at the time, and I started venturing out there almost any chance I could get. And so this map looks familiar. We just saw a version of it when Zoe was talking. But I lived somewhere in the Old North End, and this red line here was the running route that I ended up settling on. And this became a way for me to cope with the stress of grad school. It was like every evening, afternoon, when I'd get back, whatever happened that day, I could put on my running shoes, and in about a half an hour, I could be down at that beautiful spot at the thrust fault. And so this became my daily ritual. I'd run through the Old North End, along North Beach, around Rock Point, and I started keeping track of things when certain plants were flowering and when certain birds were arriving back, and keeping track of the phenology. And this became just a fun ritual that I would do almost every day. As my grad school career progressed, I expanded my range. And this was before the Burlington Wildways signs were up on this route. And I remember one day I was running and I saw these signs the whole way. And I was like, what the heck? Someone had, mapped out my route. But I quickly learned that you could run down into the intervale, and that was a place that blew my mind. I had first seen it in the early spring when it's kind of dry and dreary and flooded and muddy, and I wasn't too impressed. And about a month later, I went down there, and it was like this, tropical environment almost. It felt like the Amazon. You're running along this river, and there's this lush vegetation everywhere. It's the nettles are chest high, and this is Canada lily, one of my favorite flowers I would encounter down there, and it would bloom usually sometime in June. So again, I was just kind of captivated about these wild places that you could get to, and step out your front door and you're there in just a couple miles. And I would keep track of when things would flower and where they would flower. This is at Rock Point, and actually there's a raven's nest and a peregrine falcon's nest right near this spot. And I, year after year, would keep track of them and when they would fledge. And the ravens would fledge pretty much on time between May 13th and May 18th every single year. And I had this has nothing to do with the Bees of Burlington, but it's a cute video of two fledgling ravens right out of the nest, probably an hour or two out of the nest, teaching each other how to talk. So we couldn't get the sound to work on this, but if you've never heard a baby raven learning how to talk, it's adorable. So yeah, I'll have to show some of you that afterwards if you're interested. But I started to notice things, like I said before, that I'd never noticed before. This is a phoebe's nest that was hidden under a little boulder at Rock Point, and I found it one day, and this will tie into bees, by the way, later, I promise. And I just happened to find this little camouflage nest, an eastern phoebe, and I looked in, and one egg was different. Does anyone know what egg that belongs to? The cowbird. Yes. So cowbirds sneak into the nest of a lot of different songbirds and lay their own egg. And a couple days later, the cowbird hatched, and the phoebes hadn't hatched yet. So this is a strategy by the cowbird. It lays its egg in another bird's nest and then lets that mother bird raise their young for it. So it's kind of a brutal strategy. And a few days later, that cowbird was much larger than the phoebes, and I suspect the phoebes would have perished. That's usually what happens. The cowbird just gets all of the food. But from the cowbird's perspective, that's an innovative way to get through the world. That mother bird doesn't have to do a thing, just had to lay its egg and fly off. And this is a strategy that occurs in nature quite often. Which we'll revisit later. So again, I thought I knew all there was to know about this loop. I ran it, as often as I could for 3 years, and I eventually moved away from Burlington. But I was, again, when I thought I understood this place and what makes it tick and what was going on there, I was wrong. And so that all changed when I graduated, and my advisor knocked on my cubicle and said, the Gund Institute is looking for someone to do a pilot study looking at solar sites, and they want to sample pollinators and birds. My graduate research was in bird conservation, and so I didn't know a thing about bees, and so I was like, well, I'll learn. And so I applied and took the job. And so all summer long, I'd drive out to solar sites like this, and I would set little traps full of soapy water. and wouldn't really think about them. And the next day I'd go back and they'd be full of dead bugs, and it wasn't too exciting to me. I was more interested in what was going on with the birds, because that's what I knew. But then the time came that fall to take all of those dead bugs that were in the freezer and try and figure out what they all were. And that is when my mind was blown, because once I got these specimens pinned and dried and in a condition where you could actually identify them, and I put them underneath a microscope or under a hand lens, this is what I saw. And it was this surprising diversity that I did not expect. There were bees that could fit on the tip of your finger, like this sweat bee down here. There were turquoise bees, these big, bright green, iridescent bees, all shapes and sizes. There were bees the size of my thumb, bees the size of a fruit fly. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me. I thought someone had been pranking me, that they were just throwing these bees in these cups, because I had never seen anything like this in my life. And I thought, surely if they're showing up in all of these traps, I would have seen these at some point. I spend a lot of time looking at plants. I would see these types of bees. So these photos aren't mine. These belong to Sam Droege. He runs the bee inventory and monitoring lab for the USGS. And all of his photos are open source. You can go on there and look through his Instagram accounts and Flickr accounts at some of the amazing photos he puts up. But I saw these crazy organisms I didn't even know existed, and it just sucked me in. And so I thought to myself, what have I been missing all this time, and how have I been missing this? And it turns out they're around us all the time, everywhere we go. We just need to know where to look and what we're looking for. This is in the middle of the trail at Rock Point on a totally packed down trail. And I'll tell you later how I was able to find that. So why don't we know about these creatures? Why hasn't anyone taught us about these? Well, A, I'm here to teach you about them. And B, up until now, this is probably the only bee you've ever been exposed to. Or I'm making some assumptions here. It's likely the only bee you've ever been exposed to. So this is the European honeybee, Apis mellifera. This might be news to some of you here, and that's okay if it is. It was news to me a few years ago. The honeybee is not native to this continent. It is actually considered livestock by the USDA. It's a domesticated insect that we cultivate it used to be honey production primarily, and now it's more for agricultural pollination. And so essentially the importance of the honeybee comes from us basically destroying most of the habitat that fosters native bees. And so now we rely on honeybees to do most of that work that the native bees did. And so you've heard all this talk about colony collapse disorder and the diseases and the pressures that bees have been suffering for about the past 10 years or so. And those are valid, those are real problems, but they're part of our food system and our agricultural system, and it really doesn't have much to do with our ecology. And that's where the native bees come in. So there's two separate problems here. We have a native bee crisis and we have a managed honeybee crisis. So like I said, that's probably news to a lot of you, but just internalize that for a moment, and that will help moving forward. So normally, if I ask someone to name a bee, honeybee is the first bee that comes to mind. If I ask them to name another bee, oftentimes people will say, I didn't know there were other types of bees. And if they do, they will usually say bumblebees. And that is true. Bumblebees, they're a type of bee, and they are native. So they are actually very closely related to honeybees. They're in the same family. Like honeybees, they are social insects. The only difference being honeybees evolved in the tropics, and bumblebees evolved in the Arctic or in the tundra. And so bumblebees are more adapted to colder climates like ours, and so they go through an annual cycle. So their colonies never get very big because the whole colony will die every year, and the only survivor is next year's queens. So that's the main difference between honeybees and bumblebees, but they are both social insects. And usually, if I tell people to think of a third type of bee, again, they'll say, I didn't know there's another type of bee. And if I really tell them to think, and think really hard, they'll usually say yellow jacket. This is not a bee, it's a wasp. But it's okay. Wasps and bees are very closely related. Bees evolved from wasps. The only real difference is that wasps get their protein from other insects, they're carnivores, and bees get their protein from pollen. And so that is really the main difference between the two. So I'll forgive you if you thought that a yellow jacket was a bee, but they're not. They're wasps, and I'll get to that later. But there are more types of bees than just honeybees and bumblebees. And if anybody, you might have seen it in the promotional materials, but does anyone want to throw out a guess of how many species of bees are native to Vermont that we know of?
36.
Higher than that. Pretty much spot on is where I checked today, we're up to like 356. So we have 356 species of bees in Vermont, which is sort of new. We didn't really know that up until a few years ago. The Vermont Center for Eco-Studies started counting them. And we thought it might be somewhere around 300, and every year we find more. So we're just about 350 at this point. Anyone want to hazard a guess for the US as a whole? How many? 30,000. It's less than that. That's closer. We're somewhere around 4,000 species in the US alone. And if you think about, Vermont being a pretty small, cold state, 350 is pretty good. And then worldwide, we're somewhere around 20,000 known species of bees. So a pretty diverse group, and given that most people only know of one species, there's a lot out there to discover. And so this analogy is not mine. This is pretty much every bee talk I've ever seen has this analogy in it, but I figured I'd use it anyways. To separate out these, this idea of native bees and cultivated bees, you can think of honeybees as a chicken, because a chicken is a domesticated bird that we, use for food and really doesn't have anything to do with what's going on with wild birds and the ecology that we have with wild birds. So I like these two posters, and it actually works out well because I think that the number of species of birds in Vermont is very similar to the species of bees. I think it's somewhere around 300. I could be wrong. But anyways, I think, so the analogy works well. But we have this diverse assemblage of bees that have all sorts of different life histories and stories of their own. And we have the honeybee, that's the domesticated version of that. And then similarly with birds, you have all sorts of birds that are different shapes and sizes and life histories, but then you have a chicken. So just kind of think about those as we're going through the next stage here. And then I will kind of touch on other pollinators other than bees, because there are other pollinators in Vermont. So I'll quickly run through those. But if most people have to think of another pollinator that's not a bee, they often think of a monarch butterfly. And they're big, they're easily recognizable, they're charismatic, and you can find them pretty much all over North America. So most people know about the monarch's plight and their association with milkweed and the fact that they're declining. And so that's a lot of exposure. And who hasn't raised monarchs? Almost everybody in New England grew up raising monarchs in school at some point. This is a time lapse I took back when I lived in Burlington. I grabbed some of these from a piece of milkweed growing through the old North End. So yeah, we're very familiar with monarchs. And so to continue this bird analogy, now this is something that I think I came up with on my own, I'm not sure. But I like to compare monarchs to bald eagle. And so bald eagle similarly is a bird that is pretty much universally recognized. Everyone knows what they are. Everyone knows that they're in trouble. You can find them pretty much all over North America. Now, are bald eagles the most important bird on the continent? That's debatable. They're an important part of the food chain. Similarly, Monarchs, they're not even that good at pollination. So we'll get there. But, they're not great pollinators. Not a lot of birds eat them. They're pretty toxic. So from an ecological standpoint, they're not really like a keystone species. But by calling attention to the fact that they're declining, people are going out and they're planting butterfly gardens. And so all of these other species of butterflies that live in New England are benefiting from that. Similarly, bald eagles, when we recognized that they were declining, Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring, and everyone wants to save the bald eagle. All of these other raptors benefited. So I like to kind of compare monarchs and bald eagles just because of their role in conservation. And then I'll very quickly go through the rest of the pollinators so we can get back to the bees. But the University of New Hampshire has put out this list called the Super 7 pollinators of New England. So this is a list of other organisms, not necessarily bees, that do the bulk of pollination. And I'll just run through them really quick. Number 7 is birds. The ruby-throated hummingbird is the only bird we have in New England that we know that pollinates plants. A lot of people will ask, what about bats? That is true in the tropics and in the desert, but in New England, all of our bats are insectivores, so they don't visit flowers at all. But there are bats in other parts of the world that are frugivores that will visit flowers. You have beetles coming in at number 6. Flies coming in at number 5. So this is actually not a bee, this is a syrphid fly that is mimicking a bee. And you do often see that. A lot of flies will mimic bees. Wasps come in at number 4. I wouldn't really separate out butterflies and moths. I would just lump them into Lepidoptera, but this list separates out butterflies as number 3, moths at number 2, and number 1 is, of course, the bees. And the difference is pretty dramatic. About 80% of pollination is done by bees. So of that whole list I just showed you, the rest of them all make up about 20% of pollination. And so why is that? Well, if you just sit at a flower long enough and watch pollination occurring, you'll start to notice a pattern. So this beetle here that's on this painted trillium, you can see a little bit of pollen just dusted on its back right there. Not too much, but it's got to fly over or crawl over to another flower and place that in just the right spot to make pollination occur. And with butterflies, if you watch them, how they access nectar from a flower, they just kind of perch on the flower and very daintily just dip their proboscis. They're very clean. They don't want to get anything on them, and then they fly away. But if you've ever watched a bee pollinate, it's a totally different story. So they get up in there, and they are covered in pollen. So this is an andrina, which is a mining bee, is their common name. They are a very important early season pollinator. If you go outside and look for bees in the next couple of days, almost certainly you will see andrina. They're one of the only bees that are out right now. It's a very big genus. And by the way, when I use this SP, you're going to see this a lot. This just means that I know the genus is andrina, but I have no idea what the species is, because most of the time you can't tell what the species is unless you kill it and send it to a taxonomist. So most of the time when I'm observing bees, I can't tell you what the species is, but I can tell you that's andrina. And again, you can watch a bee on a flower, and they will just totally immerse themselves in it, just cover themselves in pollen. And this is because their life history is intrinsically tied to pollen. They feed pollen to their young. That is how their young survive. And so none of the other examples of pollinators I showed you do that. They're looking for the nectar. Nectar is like flight fuel. They don't even want the pollen. They don't want anything to do with it. It's just the pollen accidentally gets on them. But bees are different because they are trying to cover themselves in pollen. So you can actually see this if you take a bee and you look at it under a hand lens or a microscope. This is a squash bee, a very common bee here in Burlington. You'll find these a lot. If people have squash blossoms in their garden. On a hot summer day, they'll be taking a nap in there. You can kind of tap on the flower and you'll see them all fly out. Ooh. And if you zoom in a little further, you'll start to notice something about their hairs. And zoom in a little more. You see these little branches? Those are called scopa, and those evolved specifically to carry pollen. So this is an example of a bumblebee on a squash flower that I took last year. They just get covered in it. And if you look at pollen grains themselves, they have evolved ways to more easily attach themselves to bees. So it's like Velcro. And actually, bees and pollen have opposite electrical charges. So a lot of times the pollen will just stick to them, like static electricity. So they are just pollen-carrying receptacles flying around from flower to flower. So it's no surprise that they're doing the bulk of the pollination. And so this is an example. We couldn't get the sound to work earlier, but native bees have another thing in their toolkit, another strategy called buzz pollination, where they'll attach themselves to the flower and they'll vibrate at a certain frequency to release the pollen out of the flower and get covered at it. And when we did this hand pollination experiment last year on blueberries, we actually used little electric toothbrushes that vibrate at the same frequency. And you hold it up to the flower and vibrate it. You put a little petri dish under it, and the pollen just dumps out. It's like someone sneezes it out onto the petri dish. So it's really a cool thing to observe. And so I have a slow motion video. Again, you're not going to hear the sound, but you'll be able to see what they're doing. They actually unhinge their wing muscles when they do this, and they use what would be their flight muscles to vibrate. So every time you see them buzz pollinate, their wings will just kind of go flat. They unhinge those wing muscles and they buzz. And in the slow motion video, it sounds like a chainsaw. It sounds exactly like a chainsaw. So at this stage in the talk, you know about as much as I did about bees after my first field season. So now we'll turn our attention to the interval, which is why you're all here, is to see the Bees of Burlington and learn about their story. So after that first field season, they asked me to come back and do another field season. But something happened in spring of 2020 that derailed our larger plans, and we had to adapt. And so the director of the Gund Institute, Taylor Rickards, said to me, we've been doing this long-term monitoring project down in the intervale, and we haven't sampled in a few years. Why don't you go down and do that? That'll be a safe thing to do during the pandemic. You can just be out there alone. You don't have to travel or anything. And I said, great. So we set up a bunch of field sites, and I went out and placed my traps. And at the same time, I was teaching a course at UVM that was supposed to be a field course about pollinators. And I was going to bring everyone down in the field with me, and we were going to do the work together. But with the pandemic, we had to adapt. And so I had to learn how to teach a field course online. And my strategy for that was, well, if I can't take people to the bees, I'll have to bring the bees to them. And so I started putting in pollinator habitat in my little backyard in the Old North End. And I bought a pollinator mix from American Meadows that I later realized was not the native mix, so I screwed up. But I was a novice at this point. And I built some haphazard bee houses out of stuff I just found lying in the backyard. And I had a lawn chair, and I would just sit there. And I bought one of those little clip things that you put on your phone that's a magnifier to help you see closer. And I would just sit and wait. And after a month or two, things started filling in. The habitat started coming along. And by midsummer, when I was teaching my class, it looked like this. And I would just sit there with my little lens and wait for things to show up to flowers and see what I saw. And it wasn't long before things started showing up. And so this is a mason bee provisioning pollen. And so this bee in particular, they carry the pollen on the underside of their abdomen. And so when she backs in like that, she's actually rolling the pollen into a ball all the way back in the back of that cavity. And she will lay her eggs on that pollen ball. And then as they develop, they just eat away at the pollen. and I started seeing these bright green iridescent bees that I swore didn't exist. Turns out they're one of the most common bees in Vermont. I guarantee if you walk outside like June, July, into just a field, a random hay field in Vermont, just swing your net back and forth, you'll get some. They're that common. And they are part of a group called sweat bees, and for whatever reason, a lot of them come in this bright iridescent green color. So it's really striking. This is something that I love doing pollinator walks and catching these and blowing people's mind. And then I'm like, well, they're one of the more common bees. So like I said, they're part of the group of sweat bees. And this was after I pollinated, this is after I fertilized this plant here, and it had salt in the fertilizer, urea. And so I've noticed now whenever I fertilize plants, I'll find these sweat bees coming along and gathering salt. So that's something to look out for. And everywhere I went, when I would do that little loop around Rock Point and the ephemerals would be up, I would see things I'd never seen before. So this is on trout lily. These should be blooming now. Are they blooming in Burlington still, or are they past? Okay. I haven't seen any bloom out where I live. But yeah, so these, again, early spring bees pollinating the ephemerals. And literally everywhere you look, I've gotten in the habit of looking at my license plate. So this was, that first summer I really started paying attention to bees. I pried this off of my license plate, this road-killed bee here. And this is some species of Andrena. I don't know which, but covered in pollen. And, was somewhere between the New Hampshire and Maine state line is where I picked this one up. But it wasn't just bees that I started paying attention to. That door had been open to insects. I had started paying attention to, as E.O. Wilson called them, the little things that run the world. So this is a diurnal firefly, just on my fence in my backyard in the Old North End. But I couldn't believe the diversity when I took the time to just walk around and look at plants, what I would find. Just predator-prey relationships, things that, you're used to seeing on National Geographic. They're happening right there. I hate that, I feel like it's an overused naturalist adage where they say, discover what's in your own backyard. But it really is. This was my own backyard in the Old North End, and things were going on that I never knew. So this is actually an example of a bee being predated. So this is a spider that had been lying in wait for this Andrena and ambushed it, and I got to catch that all as it was happening. Calisomia promethea, I started rearing caterpillars just to see what they would turn into. This one turned into this male Calisomia here. You can tell it's a male because it's got this gigantic antenna here for detecting female pheromones. I started paying attention to wasps too. Wasps are, the new cool thing. This was actually not in Burlington. This was on the summit of Camel's Hump. I found it in a puddle. It was dead. I staged this photo to make it look like it was alive. But this is a giant, I should have put something to scale for this. This is a giant ichneumon wasp. It's about this long. And this wicked looking thing on the back here is not actually a stinger. It's called an ovipositor. So it actually can't sting you. But it can use that to pierce wood. And that's in fact what they do. They shove their ovipositor into a crack in wood and they inject their larva into a beetle. So again, not a bee, but really cool. And again, once I started paying attention, I started finding bee habitat everywhere I look. I can't tell you how many hundreds of times I ran past this branch. And one day I was reading about small carpenter bees and where they nest, and I read that they nest in sumac. And sure enough, that's the entrance hole. And now I can't go anywhere without seeing them. They're everywhere. Again, one of the more common bees. I guarantee if you go down in the Intervale tomorrow and look at a sumac branch, a dead sumac branch, you will find a Ceratina nest, a small carpenter bee. This is down at Rock Point. I started looking at the cliffs a little more, and this is a wasp's nest. I think it's a mud dauber wasp. And they use mud to make these little nests, almost like swallows. So again, you'll hear me compare insects to birds a lot in their life history and lifestyles. And this is in downtown Burlington. Again, the same thing. In nature, they do it on cliffs. In the city, they do it on our buildings, which are essentially just manufactured cliffs. But this is probably one of my favorites. So this is a damage done by a leafcutter bee. And I did not know there was such a thing as a leafcutter bee. But once I read about it and someone told me about it, I started looking for it. And this is on Church Street. I found these little half circles cut out of this little plant here. And once I realized, these leaf cutters, they'll cut these little half circles out, and they do it in flight. They don't even land on the leaf. They cut it out. Their jaws are like giant scissors, and they just cut it out. They wrap it up underneath them and fly away with it, like they're hugging it, like a little. And then they go into their nest. They mash it up into a little paste, and they use that to seal their nest entrance. I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, and so I had to see it happen. And so one day I noticed my jalapeno plants had little half circles cut out of them back in my backyard. And so I sat there all day long, didn't see a thing. But later that day, I had a bunch of people over for dinner, and we were around this little metal table on my deck, and I started hearing something buzzing around our heads, and I looked, I saw a flash of green, and it was a leaf cutter carrying a leaf, and it was trying to get to where we were sitting. And so I told everyone, get up, back away. I crawled under the table, and here it was, and it was nesting in this little pipe. So there it is, carrying the leaf, all curled up, going and mashing it up to line its nest with. And the story gets a little crazier because I noticed it was flying a little weird, and I couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. It was having a really hard time getting into that nest entrance. It almost seemed like it was drunk or something. And it's actually, if you take a really close look, it tries and tries and tries again. It keeps trying and failing. It winds up, just can't quite get there, falls again. But if you notice, there's something attached to the back of the leaf. And so I was taking a video of this, and I snapped a few screenshots of the video and sent it to a bunch of bee people I know, or bee experts and fly experts, and no one can figure out what that fly is or what it's doing. We assumed it must have been a parasite, just riding on the leaf, waiting to parasitize the nest, kind of like that cowbird. But then someone identified it to the family and said, well, they're not known to parasitize bees, that family. They parasitize something else. So to this day, this is a mystery. We cannot figure out why this fly was hitching a ride on this leaf. And if anyone has any ideas, I'd welcome them. It's almost worth writing a paper about. But I cannot figure out what was going on in this photo. But it was the first time I'd ever witnessed a leaf cutter doing its thing, which got me extremely excited. So back to the intervale. So most of what I've showed you so far are all things I found in my backyard. Now, what about what I found in an actual wild place, an urban wild? Well, it turns out we had taken a bunch of the specimens from the previous years of our intervale work, and we shared it with the Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and they came back to us and they said, holy cow, the intervale is probably one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse spots we've sampled in the state for bees. So what is going on? It's within the city limits of the largest city in the state, yet there's this insane diversity there. And organic agriculture probably has a huge part to do with it. The intervale being sort of this long time organic farming hotspot. But there's also a lot of other things going on there if you really pay attention. And one of them is this supply of early floral resources. So there's a lot of things in the intervale that flower really early and provide early nutrition for bees. And the main player in that are willow and silver maple. So willows will bloom, they're like the first things, early April usually. I don't know, even here it might be late March now. But as soon as the willows bloom, you go out and you will find Andrina, the mining bees, on them. And you'll first see the males, and you can tell they're males because they have these really long antennae, and they will just sit on the flower and wait for the females. So they come out first, sometimes days ahead of the females. So they're the first ones you'll see. And on a sunny day, go find a willow, you'll see them. It's almost a certainty. And then silver maple, they flower even more. So a lot of folks, when they think about bees and pollination, they think about, flowers, ephemerals, things you see on the ground. Most of the early spring bees are up in the trees. So it's our silver maples that bloom very early, and then our red maples that bloom just after them. A lot of these bees will specialize on them. And another thing that the intervale's got going for it is this abundance of sandy or silty soils, and ground nesting bees prefer sandy, silty soils. So these large particle sizes that you can see here, you can actually see the grains of sand there. With the intervale being a floodplain, a lot of the sand gets washed out there, and you have these big, flat, sandy deposits. They drain really well. And so if you're a ground nesting bee, you don't want to be saturated in water. You want a big rainstorm to come, and then all the water drains away real fast. And so you actually find that most bees, about 75%, nest in the ground. And so the sandy soils are a preferred habitat for them. And Arizona is actually the hotspot for bee diversity in the US, specifically because of their sandy soils and desert climates. This is another example, my favorite example of an early ground nesting bee. Again, go to a willow and you'll find them. These are Caletes, or the cellophane bees. And this was actually on coyote scat. So in the early spring, they're looking for salt. There's not a lot of places to find salt in the springtime. So they're usually going to scat to kind of lick up any minerals that might be left behind. So these are all cellophane bees, and they get their name because they actually nest in the ground, and specifically they tend to nest right in areas along streams that flood often. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would you do that? Why in the world would you nest right in the path of floodwaters? It turns out they're very close to their food source, which are willows, but their strategy to deal with that is they actually make plastic out of floral oils. And so if you dig up their nest, this is actually what it looks like. And so it looks just like cellophane. So they're called cellophane bees. Again, when I learned this, my mind was blown, and this is one of the most common bees in Vermont, cellophane bees. They're everywhere down in the intervale this time of year. Another really great example of some of the more common bees. Again, these are some of those sweat bees. This is Agachlora, or Agapostemon virescens. So this is a black and white sweat bee. And they nest in the ground, and they sometimes nest in aggregations. So they don't have a colony or anything. They're a solitary bee. They each have their own nest with their own eggs. They don't cooperate or anything, but they'll share a nest entrance. And this was, last year I was down in the intervale. This was feet from the intervale center where I saw this happen, like 10 feet. And I went over there and I was filming it, and out of the corner of my eye I saw a flash of red kind of hovering around it. And I wasn't able to get a photo of a video of it. It was too fast. But what I was seeing were some of these. And these are what we call a group that's called cuckoo bees. So think back to that cowbird that I showed at the beginning. These have that same life strategy. They're what we call kleptoparasites. So they were waiting to sneak into that nest. They were waiting around the outside for one of these to leave so they could fly in and lay their egg in the nest. That's where they get the name from, a cuckoo bee, because cuckoos do the same thing, the bird. And as it turns out, most people can't identify these. There's not currently a key to the nomad bees. And so 10 feet from the intervale center, I had hit the Wild West of bee knowledge. Like, I had found something pretty much unknown to science. Well, it's known, but no one can identify these. It's usually by the host species is how you identify them. But it's interesting. You'll notice they do look a lot like wasps. They don't have hair on them. Bees evolved from wasps. And these bees in particular no longer need to collect pollen because they lay their eggs and let their host species collect the pollen for them. So they no longer need those hairs, and so they lost them. And so they reverted back to what the wasp ancestors look like. And again, here's another cuckoo bee, a different genus. This is down in the intervale at the flower farm, Hollow Herb. And we were watching them parasitize squash bee nests. So they were going in, and the squash were down in the soil just down here. The squash bees had their nest, and these were flying in right after them. And again, just a really interesting life strategy. So we've seen this before. This is that video of the mason bee going in and out. But another feature that the intervale has is this abundance of habitat for cavity nesting bees. And so, like I said before, about 75% of bees nest in the ground. A lot of them nest in cavities. So in nature, those come in the form of snags. And what they'll do is they'll find old dead trees with beetle holes in them, and they'll use those. And there's a whole group of bees that do this. The mason bees will use mud to cap the nest hole. And so you'll see the mud right there that they use. The leaf cutter bees, that like we saw before, will use mashed up leaf material. And over time, that will fade and turn brown and really camouflage the entrance. And then there's a third kind called resin bees. And so they actually use tree sap. And so if you kind of scratch it and smell it, you'll smell pine. But that's one thing. If you walk around the intervale, you'll find snags everywhere, dead wood. Really great nesting habitat. And that carpenter bee nest I pointed out earlier, these are them. So that little hole in the sumac that I pointed out are these little turquoise bees called carpenter bees. And if you were to bisect the nest, this is what it looks like. All these little cell partitions in there with young developing. And so I did this one winter. I went down in the intervale and I snapped off a bunch of sumac, and they're dormant in the winter, and you can actually cut open the sumac very carefully so you don't slice them in half. You kind of pry them open. You can kind of pull them out, look at them, put them right back. They don't know the difference. These all survived and came out. But this is what the nest looks like inside. And I actually took this photo yesterday on an elderberry cutting that I have in my yard. And pretty much any time you have like a pithy interior to a plant, like elderberry or sumac or raspberry, they're there. It's every time I look at them. I pretty much find them. So, we touched on what's so special about the intervale, and now I get to the part of the presentation where it's like, so what? Who even cares? Why do we care about bees? I'm sure most of you wouldn't be in this room if you cared about bees to some extent, but I cracked open a book, the Xerces Society Guide to Attracting Native Pollinators. They also have a bunch out there for agriculture, for using native bee habitat to increase pollination on your farms. And when I was looking through the book, I noticed it looks exactly like the intervale. So this sketch, it looks like whoever did it was just sitting down in the intervale. I mean, you see the proximity to water, you see snags, dead wood, sandy soils. It's pretty much everything they recommend to do to support pollinators, the intervale has. So it's not a surprise that these things are down there. But the main takeaway from this, if you're a farmer and you're thinking about how do I safeguard against the decline of the honeybees, you can plant native plants, and the native bees will be there to do the work for you. And there are a lot of bees in Vermont that are specialists that a farmer might say, why do I care about them? They're not going to go anywhere near my crops. They're just going to go to the one plant that they pollinate. Well, if you provide habitat and food for the specialists, all those generalists, like the bumblebees, even honeybees, they will benefit too. And so you're going to provide more food, bigger, the honeybee colonies will grow bigger, have more workers, do more pollination. And this is actually borne out in the research. So this was a study from a few years back. Taylor Ricketts, who I work for, and one of his PhD students, Charlie Nicholson, published a paper about wild pollination and blueberry crop. And they actually went and counted how many species pollinate blueberries in Vermont, and it's something like 80 species. So this is all of them right down here. But bumblebees do most of the work. You can see that. It's bumblebees and mining bees. And then apis, those are honeybees. So they're there, but the biggest bulk of the work are bombas, which are bumblebees. And so the takeaway here is that a couple years ago, bumblebee queens we couldn't find them anywhere. They were few and far between, and blueberry growers all over the state were writing and asking what was going on to the bumblebees. And we actually noticed that year that when we went out and looked at blueberry flowers, all of the other native bees were pollinating at a higher rate that they typically do. So they were picking up the slack. So if ever there was an argument for diversity of native bees, that's it. The more types of bees you have on an agricultural landscape, if one of them suffers from something, a disease, drought, another one will come pick up the slack. And that's where diversity comes in, from an economic perspective at least. And so I do want to leave some time for questions. Hope I didn't go too long, but just wanted to acknowledge the funders of our research and our partners in our research. So the Gund Institute, where I work for, Audubon, Vermont, who we've worked with on a bird and bee friendly farming initiative the last 2-3 years, and that is funded by the Lintelak Project. And then Vermont Center for Eco Studies, which has been a huge help in IDing all of these bees that I send to them. And then the Intervale Center for having us back every year to allow us to kill some of their bees for science, which is unfortunate, but, and I do want to open it up for questions, but I'll leave you with this Andrina. All right, thank you.